All of the names in this story have been changed for privacy and security reasons. I had an old friend, Benjamin, that I met my freshman year of high school. We both were sort of the outcast of our class and bonded over the fact that nobody wanted to be our friends. He was a big dude and had a very deep, morbid sense of humor, but he was my friend. After our graduation, we planned on meeting up at my parents' house, just to hang out and kick it before we both went our separate ways for college. My dad was home that day and let Benjamin in. I was in the backyard, which led to this patio area that my family and I would watch TV at from time to time. We sat out there for a while just talking. It was mostly surface level at first, but then he started going into certain topics that were a little uncomfortable for me. I guess in that intimate of a setting, he felt like he could open up to me, which was fine, but I didn't know how to maneuver the conversations. He started it off by asking me if I had ever wanted to hurt anyone. I laughed it off. "Not really," I said, until I noticed he was dead serious. A look came over his face that I couldn't decipher, but it made me shift in my seat. He didn't say anything, so I broke the silence and apologized. I told him that I didn't, but I could understand people who did, under the right circumstances, of course. Which he then replied that he had always wanted to take someone's life, and started to go into great detail about what he would do if he got the chance. By that point, it had gotten dark and a bit colder, and I no longer felt comfortable sitting so close to him. Before I could really respond to him, my dad thankfully came out and told us that he had dinner made. My mom had just gotten home, and we all sat down to eat, the conversation leaving my mind a couple of minutes into dinner. It was only when he left that I thought of it again. To be honest, Benjamin was a complete poser. He always wanted to come off a specific way than he actually was, because he thought it made him look cool or scary. He was a bigger guy, and the reason why most people didn't bother him in school was because of that, unlike me, who was short and skinny and got bullied profusely. It was easier for a person like him to come off certain ways because people were too afraid of him to say anything. Without really knowing how to process the conversation, I brought it up to my dad the next day. I knew he wasn't going to say anything, but I'll never forget the face that he made when I told him. He chuckled for a second, and then stopped. He told me that it could be one of two things. He actually meant to eventually go out and try to hurt someone, or he was just saying it for shock value. But he told me to be aware of him and to steer clear of him if that was his intentions. His words exactly: "You never know what somebody like that is capable of, especially if they've already expressed to you what they actually desire to do to someone." I took heed of his words. I left for college in a week, and Benjamin wanted to meet up again, but I declined, telling him that I was busy getting ready for college, which was a valid reason because I was. We both went off to college as planned, and about 2 years passed when I saw Benjamin again. By that point, I had a girlfriend, had gained a bit of muscle, and a lot more confidence in myself. Life was good. Shantae, my girlfriend, and I had chosen to go to a bar that night. We sat in the back, ordered our drinks and food, and were talking about random stuff when I noticed somebody standing off to the right of our table. I looked over and we locked eyes. It was Benjamin. But this time he was like 2 times bigger than what I last saw him as, and one muscly arm of his was covered in these weird, poorly done tattoos. He had also gotten a bowl cut and grown a beard. I wouldn't have noticed him at first. He had changed so much. We both said each other's names at the same time and ran over to dap each other up. Shantae stayed where she was, and we talked for about 15 minutes before he said he had to head out. I waved him goodbye and sat back down with her, surprised that she didn't introduce herself. I asked her why she didn't come, and she waved off the question, asking me what his name was and where I knew him from. I told her, sort of taken aback by how curt she was being, but then our food came, and the conversation shifted to what we were going to do after the bar. We decided to stay at her brother's house that night because it was closer than driving back to the college. When we arrived and were settled in, I asked her why she had been so standoffish to Benjamin. She answered that she felt like she had seen him somewhere before, but didn't know for certain and didn't want to make it an issue. Some time passed, and I hadn't seen Benjamin, and almost forgot about our entire interaction that night, until I ran into Shantae's little sister, Sherry. She worked at the school library, and I was checking out a couple books for class. We were having small talk, and I remember saying to her to be careful because it was rather late, and that there probably were a lot of creeps out around this time. She replied that there were, laughing slightly. Especially Benny, she said. Not registering the nickname at first, I asked who she was referring to, and she described Benjamin completely. She said that he liked to come into the library after a certain time and mess with the younger girls who were trying to study, being loud, lewd, and rambunctious, and on several occasions, from some of the accounts from the girls around the college, had tried following them back to their dorms. She knew one of his ex-girlfriends who claimed that on several occasions he was abusive to the point he almost took her own life, twice, choking her to the point of passing out and pushing her down a flight of stairs. She had sent her pictures of the bruises and was able to file a restraining order on him, saying throughout the entire process he showed no remorse at all. This ex-girlfriend lived about 3 towns away, so she guessed that the reason he relocated to our school was it was far enough away for what he did not to follow him. He apparently was kicked out of school for it. I remember processing all this information. He seemed completely normal that night, and then I remembered the conversation we had the night before I decided to cut him off. It made sense, Shantae's disposition towards him. I told her that that was some pretty horrible information, and asked why he hadn't been reported to the authorities, if he was causing such an issue with the girls in the library. To what she replied that they were trying to get as much evidence on him to get him removed from the school. I told her if she ever needed me, to call me if he ever showed up, and left picking up my phone to call Shantae. On our call, I told her about the information that I found out about Benjamin, and she co-signed all the news. Her and her sister already had talked about him before, along with multiple girls that had come into contact with him. I decided the next night I was going to go and check on Sherry. It was a quiet night, and I talked to her for a good while, asking if she had seen Benjamin. She told me that he had come in an hour before, but had left about 30 minutes ago with the girl she assumed was his girlfriend. We talked for a little bit longer till I realized the time. I had walked there and hadn't taken my car and needed Shantae to pick me up. I gave a quick goodbye hug to Sherry and dialed Shantae's number. I walked out the double doors and was headed down the walkway of the library when I saw him. He was impossible to miss because of how big he was. There were bathrooms off to the side of the library, which nobody really liked to go to because one of the street lamps were broken, so half of it was engulfed in darkness. His back was to me, and I called over to him. He turned his body around to me almost cartoonishly, and in front of him I saw this girl. Her eyes were rolled back into her head, and as I got closer, there was a decent-sized blood print on the wall behind her. I ran over to him, shoving him away from her. He moved almost robotically away, like it was his first time learning how to walk. Slightly turning to face me, I saw that he had a knife in his hand, covered in blood. The girl had slid down the wall slowly and didn't appear to be breathing. I was shaking at this point. "What is wrong with you, man?" I said. "Is this the type of person you've become?" His eyes widened a bit, but he just stood there, his mouth opening and closing like he couldn't make up his mind on a rebuttal. I hadn't realized that Shantae had picked up, and I could hear her yelling through the phone. I quickly yelled into the phone our location, and quickly what happened, completely and fully prepared to get stabbed by him. I was bigger than I used to be, but Benjamin by far was 2-3 times bigger than me, with about 100 pounds more muscle. I steadied myself, stepping in front of the girl. "You need some serious help, dude." All he could muster was a weak, "I told you," trailing off, not finishing his sentence. He stepped towards me for a second, and then turned, running into the night. Me still keeping my eyes in the direction he ran off in, I checked on the girl, who thankfully was breathing shallowly. She had 2 stab wounds on her right side, and a big wound on the back of her head. I called the school police. Shantae got there about 5 minutes later, and thankfully was able to help with the girl's wounds. Benjamin was caught a couple of blocks from the campus and was able to overpower 2 policemen and stab one. It was enough evidence to get him put away, but once he was convicted, a slew of other crimes that he had done came out. He apparently would jump from campus to campus, trying to find young girls who would date him. If it didn't go well, or they shot down his advances, he would attack them. Every girl that was found was almost beaten to death or heavily beaten, and one girl unfortunately did die from his attacks. It was on the news a couple days later. The whole situation was extremely surreal. I'm glad we all got out okay, but it's a moment in my life that's hard to forget. This is my mom's story and not my own. She was in her late 20s and was walking home from her job at the local gas station in their area. The sun was setting and she was calling my grandfather, asking him to pick her up on the way home. She was a block away from her neighborhood when she saw a police car a couple of houses away from her, the lights on. Crossing the street, she tried to avert her gaze, having her fair share of run-ins with the police, when she noticed someone laying off to the side of the car. She slowly walked up, realizing that it was a police officer who had been stabbed a couple of times from the looks of it and didn't look to be breathing at all. She scanned the neighborhood around her, but nobody was out. Or maybe they were just hiding. This was a particularly dangerous area. All types of gang-related activities happened. Without knowing what to do, she crouched down behind the door of the car that was left open and called the police, and then tried to the best of her ability to call on his radio. His badge and gun had been taken, and luckily the police got there pretty quickly, where the man was able to be saved. If my mother hadn't been there, the man likely would have succumbed to his wounds.